that are running out of the house at 7 o'clock in the morning. They're up at 5:30 so they can make the sandwiches for the kids' lunch. They get home at 6 o'clock at night exhausted. You know, the kid has been with a nanny or a daycare or whatever. I feel for those women. I think they're very torn. And if they had their druthers, they would be home with their kids more, or at least more, work part-time or do something until the kids were older, and then they get on with their careers.
So when did feminism go off the rails? I mean, it started off as something very good.
Yeah, reform movement.
We wanted to get women do what you want, but all of a sudden it morphed into something completely different.
Yeah, the first phase was great because it was reformed. Why should a woman have to have her husband sign for her at the bank for a loan? I mean, why should a woman not be able to go to medical school? Like, all these things had to be fixed, and they were fixed. Then in the 1970s, it wasn't about equality anymore. Then it became more about women's interests. What was in women's interests? And so then we got into a phase where it wasn't about being equal to men, but getting what women want. And it also changed from a reform movement to a revolutionary movement. Now, what's the difference between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement? Reform movements have a prescribed end to them. Like the literacy movement of the 19th century, when people said every child should learn to read, not just the rich people. Every child should learn to read. So in 1985 in Britain, you had the Universal Literacy Act, where every child was guaranteed to go to school. And you know what? That movement disappeared because it achieved its goal. But when people get very invested in a movement, and they've got jobs because of that movement, and they don't want to see it end, then it turns into a revolution. Revolutions never end, because revolutions never there's no end goal. They keep moving the goalposts. So now you've got an industry, you've got a feminism industry. Everybody's very invested, so they have to keep saying it's not good enough, it's not good enough. So they just keep moving the goalposts. That all started in the 70s. That was the second phase. Now we got into the third phase, where it's sort of post-feminist, where the academics and the writers and the active feminists are still as revolutionary as ever, but actual women are out there doing what they want to do and not listening to the theorists. And the women's studies programs at the university are not doing well. They're dropping out. They had to change it to gender studies instead of women's studies. And a lot of people are taking gender studies, but they don't take it very seriously. I don't think anybody takes anything they say very seriously, except people in the universities.
Well, now you've got not just gender studies, you've got a whole variety of other studies.
Yeah, interdisciplinary things, yeah.
You know.
It's race, gender, culture, like, you've got disability study. All the identity studies, they're all mixed up together, but they all have the same flaw at the bottom of them, that your identity is the only thing that counts.
It's quite frightening. I mean, and I feel sorry for what are these people going to do when they, well, in a sense, there's fewer jobs for these people when they leave university.
Yeah, because the only jobs are in the universities, because they're the only people that care. And when you get out in the world, what are you going to do with gender studies?
We've been talking about that a lot.
What?
That's very true, the Human Rights Commission. And this leads into, going back to the, Bruce Powell wrote about the victims' revolution, or revolution of the victims, and you say in your book, when you start to talk about the politicization of the classroom, when you ask for people to give you responses of real-life examples, you got over 100 responses of politics in the classroom.
Yeah, and some of them were really astonishing. One guy wrote in and said, we were told we weren't allowed to use Fraser reports in economics because that was too masculine. That wasn't appropriate. There was. I remember one guy who was studying to be a nurse. I mean, this is a real women's discipline. And on the day of the Montreal massacre, the whole class was told that they were going to a memorial for it, and he was told that he had to attend this memorial service. And he said he didn't want to attend, and the teacher said, but he had to attend as a man. He had to attend, and he said, well, I don't see why I should be made responsible for the Montreal Massacre any more than Karla Homolka represents, all women. Like Mark Lepine does not represent me, and she made him he has to take some kind of, I don't know, re-education classes like some Maoist. And then one girl said that she wrote a paper defending Israel in one of the issues, the Middle East issues, and her teacher took her aside after and said, "You can't say those kinds of things. I won't mark your paper. You cannot say what you said." She actually complained to the head of the department, who was sympathetic to her, and that professor was not. She was actually a visiting professor from Princeton, was not asked back. But I just got, example after example of such idiotic, truly idiotic statements from teachers. I just couldn't believe it.
If you watch the film Indoctrinate You,
Oh, yes.
there's a great scene in that film where there's a professor, and she said, my students come in and they ask me if I'm a conservative. And I said, why do you ask if I'm a conservative? She said, well, you're the only professor who doesn't bring politics into the classroom.
Yes. Isn't that something? Yeah, that was actually an excellent film. That was a wonderful film.
So you talked about the Lepine massacre. In your book, you challenged the narrative of that massacre.
Yeah, because that massacre has been exploited by feminists to be a day. It's a day that commemorates violence against women in general in the culture. But those women were not killed by the culture or by violence in the culture. They were killed by a crazy guy. One crazy guy who had a thing against women. He was also the son of a brutal Algerian immigrant who beat his mother. He was brought up in an extremely dysfunctional home, and he had issues. He also had a plan to bump off a whole bunch of people in a regiment because he had been denied. He was being kicked out of. He tried to join the military, and he was kicked out very early because he was found to have, and he had a whole plan. He was going to kill a whole barracks full of soldiers. Well, so he was an equal opportunity nut. So turning the Montreal Massacre, exploiting it as a political and ideological statement about, you see, women are victims, women are only victims, women are always victims, and Mark Lepine stands for all men who would hurt women if they could, or who would like to. There's a message there, and I resent it deeply, and every year, for years and years, I used to write on December 7th, I would write my Montreal Massacre call, like it got to be a kind of tradition. But you notice that they sort of died out a lot, which is nice.
No, sometimes I thought perhaps of having a counter event on that day here, and maybe bring in Phyllis Chesler from New York City and talk about his real name was Garvey, and talk about some of the cultural influences on his life. It would be a firestorm.
Well, that's it. You want to hedge your bets here. Like, I think you should let the day pass and do it on another occasion. But it's certainly too bad that this whole white ribbon campaign, which began with the Montreal Massacre and infiltrated the schools and in all our institutions, it turned us into a culture that thinks that domestic violence is A, pandemic, and B, that it's a one-way thing, that only women are victims and always victims, that there's no such thing as any other kind of violence, which is wrong. Another lie.
So have men become victims of this political correctness or this feminism?
Good men are victims in our society. I mean, good men suffer because of bad men. There are plenty of bad men, but there are plenty of good men, and there's a tendency to lump. This is identity culture. If you are a man, then these are your characteristics, and they're always the lowest common denominator. If you are a woman, you never hear people say that Karla Homolka stands for all women. You never hear about women that kill their children. No, they all have very special problems. They don't stand in for all women. But all men who kill, all men who beat, all men who, they are, well, you see, that's men. So yes, they do suffer culturally. They suffer institutionally in not having resources. There are no resources to help men, or pretty well none. They suffer in family court because of the prejudice that only women are necessary, mothers are necessary, and that fathers are not necessary. They suffer and they suffer from being ignored. They suffer in a passive sense. Like one of the bees in my bonnet is Remembrance Day. How it changed from honoring the service of fallen soldiers to, all of a sudden it's like the men and women of the military. I'm not saying the women don't serve very well, but Remembrance Day is about people who died, or it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be about honoring clerks and administrative personnel and everybody else. We just had this recently in the changing the anthem in All Thy Sons Command and All of Us Command. I wrote a spirited defense of in All Thy Sons Command. But this is the general trend. It's away from any opportunity that there might be to valorize men's heroism or their courage, the things that do typify good men, is kind of glossed over. And people get very indignant if you don't include women in those. And at the same time, there are many occasions in which women's special qualities are indeed valorized.
And we also don't talk much about the positive attributes of fathers.
For sure not.
In your book, you talk about your father and how well respected he was, and you say, in fact, when you had friends over and you talked about your father's position, that there was a smile on their face.
That was one of the reasons that I'm so sensitive to this whole issue of how important fathers are, is because my own father was a hero to me. And he was not a very involved father, by the way, because he was working he had been very poor, and he was a workaholic, and he was trying very hard to make a life for us that was much better than what he had had. But he was also very philanthropic. He was very proud of us. We wanted him to be proud of us, and we worked hard so that when he walked in, he would say, what marks did you get? And so we could tell him about great marks and all that. But what you mentioned, the smile on the face, but when people would say, who's your father? And I would say, my father's Teddy Richmond. And they would say, oh, Teddy, yeah, he's a great guy. Like, wow, that's social capital. That is social capital for a child. And it gives a child confidence. I'm not saying it's not great to hear your mother praised. Everybody likes to hear their mother praised. But I think for a daughter,